This happened to me and my friends tonight. I was genuinely scared by what went down. Me, a 29-year-old female, and my friends play in a bar kickball league every Thursday. We're pretty bad, and mostly just enjoy going to the bar that sponsors the league after every game. But tonight, shit got weird. I'll call the bar Dan's. It was down to me and two other friends, who I'll call Ryan, a 24-year-old male, and Annie, a 27-year-old female. For context, Dan's is in a part of our city that used to be a little sketchy, but has steadily gotten nicer. It's a super popular strip of bars, but it's also an urban place, so you see weird shit from time to time. We were sitting on the front patio of Dan's when this man rolled up on a bike with this huge stomach with a literal hernia sticking out of it, wearing basketball shorts and one of those short sleeve hoodie zip up things, but according to him the zipper was broken, so it was left open to put his belly and huge ass hernia on display. He started trying to sell us his bike, which was clearly stolen. We played along but kept declining, citing not having any cash. He kept saying over and over how annoying it was that we wouldn't buy his bike. One particularly creepy thing he said was when he said that if we bought the bike, he'd walk home to the exact neighborhood that both Annie and I lived in. Probably a coincidence, but it was still scary. He also kept asking us for cigarettes. At one point, the man said, "You know what else would be annoying? If I had a gun." We froze. It was dead silent between the four of us for at least 60 seconds, which of course felt like 12 years. I finally broke the silence and said, "You know, man, I think some people on the back patio were smoking cigarettes. You should go ask them." I was desperately hoping that he'd walk into the bar and catch the bouncer's attention, which is exactly what happened. 2 seconds later, the bouncer marched him outside. The man kept making comments over and over about having a gun and slugs in his pocket. The bouncer kept trying to play it off and keep the dude calm. Finally, the bouncer negotiated with the guy and gave him a cigarette to get him to leave their patio. The dude strolled on down to the next bar, and Ryan, Annie, and I made a quick dash for the car. We all made it home safely, but I really questioned what the fuck was about to happen if the bouncer hadn't handled that dude so well. Weird ass guy with the stolen bike? Let's not meet again. My name is Mia, and I'm 19 years old. When this happened, I was 10. I was at my best friend's house for a sleepover. It was in November, and there was a little bit of snow outside. It was dark outside, and only about 6 p.m. We had eaten dinner, and wanted to go play outside. We put on our winter coats and boots before walking out. My best friend's grandfather had passed away when she was 8, and they were really close. He was buried in the cemetery that was really close to her house. Every time we went outside, we'd always go by and say hi to him. He was a really kind man, and I loved hanging out with him and my best friend. So, of course, we made our way to the cemetery. It was cold, and I felt my toes freezing as we walked through the gate. It wasn't a big cemetery. There were only about 50 tombstones. And we didn't see anyone there when we arrived, and thought it was cool because that way we could talk with her grandpa out loud. We sat in front of his stone and started talking about what happened recently in our lives. We sat there for about 30 minutes, and we saw no one else. At least, that's what we thought. After a while, we heard a really loud laugh, and we froze. We looked around to see where it was coming from, but it was dark, and we couldn't see well around us. We were young, and immediately started panicking. My best friend was always more rational than me,
and she told me it was probably teenagers that were walking up the main street or something. But then, we heard it again, and it was closer. It seemed to be an adult male voice. I nearly pissed myself when I heard it. It was dark, and we were young. We got closer to the tombstone, thinking that maybe he wouldn't be able to see us. And luckily, it worked. Our eyes were getting adjusted to the dark. And that's when we saw a man getting up from behind a tombstone, a couple of rows in front of us. He got up and walked away through the gates. We quickly got up and ran to her house. Her parents were surprised we came home so fast. We didn't tell them because we were too scared, and just went to her room. We still talk about it sometimes. It was the scariest experience that I've ever had.
This happened a little over 15 years ago. I had just graduated college and had gotten an apartment by myself off campus. One evening, I had to wash my sheets and went down to my apartment's little laundromat. It was in a building that sat in the center of a cluster of apartment buildings, not too far from mine. I usually did my laundry on campus because it was cheaper and had more amenities, but that evening was a lovely one, and I didn't mind the walk. As I was getting my sheets into the washer, the couple that had been folding their laundry packed up and left. Before they did, they offered to leave the door propped open to let in a nice breeze. I agreed, and found myself alone on a nice night with the soothing white noise of running laundry machines. I had brought a book, so I made myself comfortable on a bench and began to read. Not too long after that, a man walked in with a little basket and closed the door behind him. He was older, wearing ripped up, dirty clothes. I was annoyed, but I didn't think anything of it. I wasn't going to engage or say anything, mostly because I was alone with him in a closed room. I figured I'd prop it back open after he left. He set his basket down on the table in the middle of the room, saw me on the bench, and came over. He pointed at my book and seemed to be speaking words. I couldn't tell if it was another language. I know a bit of Spanish, and it sounded a little like that, but it was mostly grunting and gibberish. I looked at him and nodded, but since I was utterly uninterested in engaging with him further, I went back to reading. He walked back to his laundry basket, pulled a few pieces of clothing out, and then walked back over to me. He pointed at my book again, this time jabbing his finger down onto the pages. I pulled back, told him the title of the book, and then went back to reading. I was still unable to understand anything he said, and I was just trying to be polite. But I also didn't want to encourage him either. I was starting to get nervous, but I also didn't know if he was impaired in some way, if he needed help or just didn't know any better. So that made me feel bad about being nervous and making assumptions. Once again, he walked back over to his laundry basket, pushed it around a bit on the table, and then walked back over to me. This time, he stood almost next to me, looming over me as I was still sitting on the bench. He held out his hand, like he wanted me to shake it. Wanting him to just leave me alone, I reached to shake his hand quickly, planning to stand up and leave afterwards. Before I could, he gripped my hand tightly, then slid his hand under my bottom, where he groped and squeezed as hard as he could. Yelling, I pulled out of his grip, jumped up and put the bench between us. He started to approach me, but I held up my phone and threatened to call the police. I should have just done that, but I wasn't thinking clearly. He held up his hands like he was trying to calm me down. Then he turned, grabbed his basket, and ran out of the building. I was shaking so hard that I almost dropped my phone. I grabbed my soaking wet sheets from the washer and ran back to my building as fast as I could. I locked the door and put furniture in front of it before collapsing to the ground and sobbing. I didn't tell my parents.
They lived 8 hours away and were already worried about me living by myself. I was still young enough that I thought they would immediately drag me back home with them if they found out. I don't know why I didn't call the police. It was the encouragement from my boyfriend at the time, who lived an hour away, and that got me to call them the next day, because he was horrified I hadn't immediately done so when it happened. They showed up at my work and interviewed me there. Basically, they told me there was nothing they could do, since there wasn't any full-on penetration, but if I wanted to pursue it, I could get a lawyer and file a report at the police station. And they also said that probably wouldn't do any good, since I didn't know the man's name, or even if he lived at the apartment complex. And they told me to find that out, and then file the report. But other than that, they said there was nothing they could do. I was flabbergasted and said, "So that's it? What if he comes back? What if he does this to someone else?" All they said was, if it happens again, call them. Other than that, don't do laundry by myself. My apartment complex was slightly less useless. They figured out who he probably was, but they also didn't know where he was. They didn't have any identification for him because he was living in an apartment with other people, not paying rent, so his name wasn't on any paperwork. They think he had a caretaker of some sort that he probably got away from that night. They said they did an investigation to find him, but I doubt they actually did. And given that they couldn't, or wouldn't, give me a name for me to take to the police, I gave them my 30-day notice and found another place to live. Looking back, I'm just aghast at how I was treated by the police. And they weren't concerned about the guy. They were concerned about why I was by myself and why I let myself be cornered by him. It was humiliating, especially since my boss heard every word of it. So, next time you think to yourself, why didn't they just go to the police when it happened? That's why. That's how they treat you. So, laundromat creep, let's not meet again.